Mr. Chairman, this is a very important issue, and it's one which I don't think has had enough exposure and discussion so far in Parliament. So I'm pleased to see so many honourable colleagues here today. Because fake news, but not just fake news, but also fake science, fake medicine, online memes of one kind or another, I suspect everybody here today will have had far too many examples than they can possibly count landing in their in-trays from their constituents. And it isn't just a question of what happens when constituents write to members of Parliament. It is a much, much broader issue than that, something which affects the whole tenor and fabric of our democracy and of our public debate. And it's particularly important because obviously public debate in these online days happens in a far, far wider and more varied collection of different forums than it used to before the internet was nearly so commonly and widely used. So it is something which needs to be addressed, and I would just point out, Simon, that the happily give way.
Actually, I'm on this timely debate. Would you agree with me that what he's saying about the prevalence of fake news is all-consuming? And it was put to me a few years ago that there was a quote put to me on social media as a Member of Parliament, and it was along the lines of, as in the words of Abraham Lincoln, don't believe all you read on the internet.
Well, indeed, Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. It used to be that the saying was don't believe everything you read in the newspapers, and it applies equally strongly in the modern digital world to everything that you read on the internet as well. And the importance of fake news, of misinformation and disinformation really matters, particularly, Sir Mark, this year, because we have a very large proportion of the democratic world is having general elections in the next 12 months. The scope for interference in those elections by malign actors, whether they are foreign states, whether they are organised criminals, whether they are people of a particular religious or political persuasion, trying to sway public debate through fair means or foul, and if we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, that means foul means, is very, very strong. The potential in the next 12 months for bad things to happen is very, very high. And that's just when it comes to democracy. It doesn't cover all the other examples I just mentioned just now, things to do with fake news or fake science about things like medicine, which can lead to more deaths and more people getting the wrong kinds of medical treatments if those quack cures are believed, and so on. So there are many different opportunities. And also, so Mark, there's a very serious issue around radicalisation as well. Because if you are somebody who is fed a diet of alt-left or alt-right political views, of particular extremist religious views, it doesn't really matter what it is. You can easily disappear down a rabbit hole into an echo chamber, if you like, of views where only one particular strand of opinion is being put in front of you again and again and again and again, and that way leads to radicalisation on a whole range of different topics, and that undermines both our society and our democracy. It undermines science in many cases, and it means that societies as a whole become much more brittle, much more divided, and it is much, much harder for democracy to flourish as well. So what is actually misinformation and disinformation? There's without getting sucked into technocratic definitions, it's rather like trying to define pornography, which in the famous phrase, you may not recognise it, you may not be able to define it, but like a hippopotamus, you recognise it when you see it. And the point about misinformation and disinformation is that there are probably, I'm going to ignore the heckling going on my right over there, it won't help. The point about misinformation and disinformation is I think that there are two underlying facets to it. One is if someone is just simply making stuff up, telling lies, things which are factually inaccurate and false. That's clearly can easily become misinformation and disinformation. But there's a second kind of misinformation and disinformation as well, and that is things which are factually accurate and correct, but are just really one-sided and biased. That matters too. It's extremely important, and it's something which we have long had rules which affect our broadcasters in this country, which I'll come back to in a minute, designed to prevent. Now, the good news, Sir Mark, is that the Online Safety Act, as it now is, began to take a few early steps in the direction of trying to do something about at least part of this, which is the factual inaccuracy. It doesn't do a great deal, and I think it should do a great deal more. But it does at least take some early steps, and it would be churlish, I think, to pretend that there's nothing there at all. I tabled a couple of amendments at an early stage talking about this and trying to get us to think about factual inaccuracy, perhaps working out where things came from, provenance in the jargon, so we can tell if something comes from a trusted source or not. And we ended up, Sir Mark, with some useful points and some duties, particularly on Ofcom, to do with media literacy and trying to make sure that people know what questions to ask when they see something on the internet, so they don't, as we were just hearing, they don't necessarily believe everything that they read online, and they ask questions about, well, where did this come from, who produced it, has it been altered, all those important things. Ofcom has that duty on it now, Sir Mark. It has not yet grown teeth and claws and hasn't started to bite, but at least in principle it is there, and that is very, very welcome. And there's also, of course, the advisory committee enshrined in the Act, which ought to make a difference as well, although precisely how, I think, will depend very much on how actively it flexes the muscles that it's been given. And there is, of course, as well, separately from the Online Safety Act, online harms, there is the national security laws about foreign interference too. So there is some protection in place, but as I said just now, it isn't really nearly enough. And it's interesting, if you talk to the minister's predecessors, in what used to be the Department for Culture, Media, Sport and Digital, before it was reorganised, they will say that in the early days of the gestation of the Online Harms Bill as it then was, there was an intention for it to cover misinformation and disinformation, and that was hived off and fell away at an early stage. I think that that is an important omission. I think it's something we need to come back to now. And so I wanted to, Sir Mark, come up with a modest proposal, if I can, which is this. If you think that while the Online Harms and Online Safety Act will start to make some modest progress towards media literacy and for people to understand, to ask the questions about factual accuracy and where something comes from when they see it on the web, that will go some way to addressing the first of the two sources of misinformation and disinformation, i.e. people telling lies, making stuff up, deep fakes of one kind or another, and it's a sad fact that the chances of deep fakes getting better and better and better with the advent of artificial intelligence is very, very high indeed. So even if we think we can spot it now, and we can spot deep fakes now, we're probably kidding ourselves already, but in a year or two's time it will be doubly, trebly, quadruply difficult to work out what is real and what is completely made up. If you accept that there is at least something in place, as we currently are in this country, to deal with factual inaccuracy, we are still stuck with absolutely nothing as yet to deal with the one-sided, deeply biased presentation of factually correct narratives. And so therefore I want to draw a comparison, if I can, as I mentioned before, between what we already do and have been doing very successfully for decades in the broadcasting world, where there has for a very long time been the Ofcom has been in charge of something called the duty of balance and undue prominence in the Ofcom broadcasting code, and that takes for the analog broadcasting world, it has very successfully for decades and decades said you need to make sure that when you are presenting something which is supposed to be factual in a broadcast news program, it has to be balanced and it must not give undue prominence to one side of the argument or another. This works, Sir Mark, it works really rather well. It has been a core part of ensuring that our public debates in this country are not sidetracked by fake news. And whether or not, and I suspect every one of us in this room will at various different times have gnashed our teeth and shouted at the telly because we feel that the BBC or ITV or Sky News is presenting something in a slightly partisan way, And depending on where we are sitting in this room, we may think that the partisanship has been on one side of the argument or the other. But the fact remains that they are supposed to. We all know they're supposed to do it that way, and there is some kind of redress, and there is generally an acceptance that this is the right thing to do. And it matters not just because politicians think it's important. It matters because what is done very successfully, I would argue, over more than half a century, is it has made sure that there is a tendency towards consensus, reasoned consensus, evidence-based consensus in British public debate online now and in broadcast news. So when we come to the title of this debate, which is not just misinformation and disinformation, but those two things in online filter bubbles, the point I want to advance to everybody here, and more broadly, is that I think that online filter bubbles bear some quite important similarities to what broadcast news editorial room decision-making have long been doing. And the reason why is because we all, when we go online, we all have our own personal online filter bubble, whether or not we use Google, whether or not we use Facebook, whether or not we use TikTok, or whatever it might be, or all of the above. Those platforms will have an algorithm that says, John Penrose likes looking at stuff to do with fishing tackle, we're going to send him more stuff about fishing tackle. I'm not sure what the equivalent would be for the minister. I'm sure he will tell us in due course, or he will if he's not too shy. But the point about it is, it works out what we have personally chosen to look at, and it gives us more of the same. That is the thing that can also, incidentally, lead to radicalization, because if I start looking at things to do with Islamic jihad, it'll say, oh, he's interested in Islamic jihad, and he'll send me more and more things about Islamic jihad, or alt-left, or alt-right, or whatever it might be. But that algorithm, that decision to send you more of what you've already chosen, is effectively an editorial decision which is very, very similar. It's a digital version of it, but in principle it is very, very similar to send you, when it sends you things that you have not chosen, but they think that you will like, it is very, very similar to the editorial decisions going on in Sky newsrooms or in the ITV newsrooms or in the BBC newsrooms, either on radio or on broadcast TV. And so the point which I would like to advance for everybody here is that we need to come up with a modern digital version of that principle, which is long established and very successful, as I said, and apply it to the modern digital world. Because if it meant that I start looking at Islamic jihad, and I get sent more and more things about Islamic jihad, what it would mean is that if you had a modern digital version of the duty of balance and undue prominence, what it's called, then what you would do is, as I saw more and more things about Islamic jihad, I would start being sent things by the algorithm which is creating my personal filter bubble saying, you do know there's an alternative here. You do know there's another side of this argument. You do know that this is, the world is not just this, and that this particular echo chamber, this particular rabbit hole of radicalization that you are enthusiastically burrowing your way down may actually be exactly that. You need to understand that there is more to it. And that's something which happens to us all the time in the old analog world and does not happen in the digital world. And I would argue that it is one of the reasons why many of us here on all sides of the political spectrum are so worried about the divisive nature and the rising levels of disrespect and potential incitement to violence, which is happening in the online world as well. So Mark, I plan to do something rather unusual for politicians and stop talking very, very soon, because I hope that this has served as a proposal for colleagues to consider. This is something which I think would need cross-party consensus behind it in order to take it forward, and there may be better ways of doing it. But what I'm absolutely certain, Sir Mark, is that we do not have anything in this area at the moment in our legal arsenal. We need to act, I would argue, quite promptly. The stakes in the next 12 months, as I said, democratically are very, very high, but they have been very, very high because in other areas such as, for example, medical disinformation, since we've just come through a pandemic, they've already been very, very high for a very long time. The scope for damage to our society, to our health, to our entire lives is very, very high. And therefore, I hope that colleagues will both consider what I've said And if they've got a better answer, I'm all ears. I would be absolutely delighted. This is a very early stage in the political debate. But we cannot carry on not having this political debate. We cannot carry on not addressing this central issue. And so I'm glad that everybody is here today. I hope that we will all go forth and tell our political friends and neighbours that this is important and that they need to take part in this as well. And if people have better solutions than the one that I have just politely proffered, then my pen is poised and I look forward to taking notes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.